like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Z-Man, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing very good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. I always enjoy our conversations quite a bit. And I will say, for my audience, the technical issue has been solved. So you will be hearing me out of 2 ears instead of only one. Sorry about that. Just had some hardware issues that have been resolved. But obviously, I'm not just here to talk about my inability to make a podcast after almost 300 episodes. I'm here to talk with you, Z-Man, about kind of the current state of things, right? Because I think one of the most interesting developments of the Trump presidency has been this kind of bizarre divide among our circles, where either, you see people who've essentially been brought back into the fold, right? They are full on, MAGA Republicans. Trump is going to save the world. Trump is going to, get us to that ideal state. Or alternately, and I think you see this particularly among the, the European chapter of the right, this kind of endless doom and gloom, right? Old Zion Dawn is back. And that's not really how I view things, right? I view this as, while certainly a win, a conditional one. It's not the end. And I'm curious, right? Where do you find yourself falling, and what do you see as being kind of the relevant developments?
Well, broadly speaking, right-wing politics, or what we call the right in the United States, has always had an element of people who like being a medium-sized fish in a very small pond. They carve out these sort of little sort of subcultures where, they get to be the star of the event that has 25 people show up, or, the online group that has, 50 people who listen to the live stream, that kind of stuff. And, they often act like the kinds of people who found a new band or a cool little restaurant. They love the fact that nobody goes there or nobody really listens to it. And so once it starts getting popular, they feel as if, oh, well, it's sold out. It's not the same as it used to be. And that's how they look at a lot of this politics. I mean, because look, many of the things that were only said in, banned live streams and banned internet places are now coming out of the mouths of the president, the vice president, and his people. I mean, some of the things that JD Vance says were things that got you thrown off of Twitter 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so, there's a lot of good stuff happening, but these people look at that and they don't want to be winners. I hate to use that word, but there's some part of their identity is in failure. And there's some beautiful losers. I mean, this is what Sam Francis wrote about 1 million years ago, and that it's the people who just sort of want to cling on to either their tiny little piece, or maybe they cling on to the past. That's just who they are. And so success really is actually the worst thing that can happen to them. But there's also people, I think, that just have an obsession over one particular issue, and you can never be satisfied with it. It's a very weird thing. Trump, when it comes to our greatest ally, he gives a lot of lip service, but he doesn't deliver a lot. If you actually read the Israeli news or listen to some of the Israelis, they kind of think Trump is selling them a false promise. They don't really think that Trump actually delivers much for them. It's odd in a way. The people who are always complaining about Trump in our side, in America, complaining, oh, Trump never follows through with stuff. Well, we're not the only ones he kind of gyps every once in a while, overselling things. But, if your only issue, the only thing you care about is getting up in the morning and finding out what's going on with Israel, well, you're never going to be happy. So, there's those two kinds of groups. But I think there's people who just I don't really think they understand the nature of the problem. We're not changing policy here. We need to change a culture and an economy, a political economy in Washington. This whole blob business where you had $40 billion of USAID money, tens of billions of dollars, probably as much, maybe 40, 50 billion dollars coming out of individual agencies as grants and subscriptions and all kinds of ways to send taxpayer money into these not-for-profits and NGOs and think tanks and all media companies. And then, they used a lot of this money to harvest and control the private money. I mean, you're talking about $100 billion a year. I mean, this is an enormous amount of money feeding into this system, all of which was used to bribe politicians, control the media, control access to power, to fund people who run around looking for, oh my goodness, the Z-Man said something untoward to this group. Aha, let's destroy his life. Let's go after this guy. All the doxing people, all these guys, we're all funded with this stuff. And going after that political economy is huge. That is an enormous change because, that's why everyone's so terrified in Washington right now. And once you dismantle, you stick the a knife through the you put the ice pick in the head of the blob, so to speak. All of a sudden, lots of other things become possible. The world really does change, but it's not going to change overnight. It just means that you now have an opportunity to organize and work hard and try and affect change. The biggest problem we've had over the last 30 years, probably most of my adult lifetime, is that there's been no way for normal people to participate in politics and get a positive result. You can vote yourself silly, and you just kept getting the same crap over and over again. Now, all of a sudden, things are starting to change. You can actually expect something other than the usual crap. So there's a lot of good stuff here, but there's always a lot of people who just don't understand that. They look and say, well, Trump promised mass deportations. They don't know what that really looks like, but they feel they're not getting it. So, he ripped us off again, So, there's always going to be that element. There's always going to be people who like that. But I think most people understand that we're in the middle of something different. This is very different. I don't want to use the word revolution, but there are things happening now that I remember paleocons talking about when I was a young man, which trust me, was a long time ago. And no one has ever thought were possible. They laid off 90% of the staff at the Department of Education. Republicans have been running on that for, probably since Jimmy Carter. And all of a sudden it's happened. Now, it doesn't mean that they, saved all $230 billion or whatever. Most of it is student loans, but still, there's a lot of good stuff happening. And, we'll see what happens. We'll see if it actually goes and continues on the direction it is. But right now, if you're not feeling pretty chipper about the state of things, you'll never be happy. You're someone who will just be miserable for the rest of your life.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up, that idea of changing what is perceived to be possible, because one of the strongest weapons in our enemy's arsenal is the ability to set the null hypothesis, right? What is seen as normal and acceptable. And if anything, right, British politician Tony Blair was a master of this, where he would basically push for some radical change, but cast it as if, this is simply, the decision has been made, right? The conversation is already over. And, you see this in the way, for instance, that the UK banned guns, right? He expressed that as if, that was an issue that had already been decided, right? The voice of history is spoken and this is done. And, for a long time, this is something Republicans have been fighting up against, right? You can, see over and over and over again, where Republicans effectively have, adopted the framework of their enemies, right? Okay, well, this is already decided. Roe versus Wade is already decided. We're simply managing, everything after that point. And, the ability to, as the meme says, right, simply do things is huge, right? I sort of echo your points about Israel. To me, look, like, obviously that is a heavily embedded interest group, right? One of the most powerful lobbies, as, John Mearsheimer will tell you. But it is not the sole determinant factor in politics, right? That is not, it's not like you solve that issue and then everything goes away. It's a complicated system. And to me, right, I keep going back to, the binary choice, however much a choice that was, is, up for debate between, Harris and Trump. And look, as someone who actually lives here, I don't regret my choice, right? That was a pretty easy choice to make. And, you mentioned the incredible, corruption of all of this, right? The fact that, most of the opposition to things that we think was not organic. It wasn't real. It wasn't, as it is often presented, the inevitable conclusion to that argument. It was simply, right, government fiat. They just gave money to people who had views that they liked, right? The BBC got money, Axios got money, as you mentioned, but even people like Politico, right, who is in charge of so-called fact checking. And to me, right, it very much reminds me of Curtis Yarvin's point, where he says, people look askance at the Soviet system, but really we live in an economy or a society that's just as much controlled by the government. And people laughed at him right back in 2008 when he wrote it. But, you look at the receipts and it turns out that, he may have been underestimating it, right? It turns out that literally almost all of these people are getting, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Like the example that comes to mind is Christianity Today, right? One of these kind of like left-leaning evangelical newspapers. And this organization swung hard to the left, really post 2020. And you'll never guess what happened just before that. They got $2 million from the federal government, right? It's amazing how that strategy works, right?
Yeah, the environmental groups were all paid off with donor money. Because all this stuff gets laundered. I wrote about this 10 years ago, maybe. I don't know. It's been a long time now, but about how this laundering works. Now, I think I did a show on this recently about how this, but I don't know. Yeah, honestly, I produce so much content, I kind of lose track of what the hell I'm doing sometimes. But there's this money laundering is really what this system was. No one really could know for sure. So it felt like community money to people. One of the weird things about, and this was true in the Soviet Union, and honestly, it was true in pre-revolutionary France. You see these phenomena show up where all of a sudden a culture and there's everywhere around you in the elite is social proof. And it just feels like you have no choice but to go along with what everybody else is doing. And because it seems like, well, you're getting finance from this guy and he thinks this, and you're getting a job maybe from this guy and he thinks this, everywhere you turn, everything you count on in terms of your lifestyle and how you live your life is, all these sources all seem to be on the same page. Well, it turns out that they're all being paid by the same source. So sure they are, but it doesn't seem that way to you. If these people were actually getting a direct government check instead of getting, support from people who seem to be their friends, they probably would have been, some of them would have been more suspicious. But it just kind of feels like, hey, everybody's doing this. And it's, this social proof that's developed around it. It's exactly how the Soviet system worked. They had this thing called the embankment, to set up apartments that were up on this hill and on the river in Moscow. And all the apparatchiks, the new class, they lived there. And it became a part, they became a new class. They got class consciousness. And that literally is what's happened in Washington. It's the embankment now. It's this, or Versailles. There's another example, where all the royals, all the aristocrats live in this one area, isolated from everyone else. And so it's very easy to control the mental space they live in. And that really is what's happened in Washington. That's why, all these right-wing people, supposedly right-wing people, they would start out working for a National Review or the Federalist or, Cato or, these different operations, and before long they're at the Washington Post or the New York Times sounding just like the people they used to oppose. Like, how is this happening? Well, they're all their friends. They just evolved with their friends. I mean, Pat Buchanan talked about this back 1992, is famous at the time. He said, you elect your congressman, he goes to Washington. Before long, he turns into a native of Washington. And that's exactly what's been happening. But it was all made possible by billions and billions and billions of taxpayer dollars financing this political economy that was Washington. And it's going to be interesting to watch. When you're talking about laying off 20% of the federal workforce, which is what they're actually doing right now, they're laying off a lot of people, but also piercing this this blob and draining money out of it. I mean, I've often said that every mortgage payment in Washington, every college tuition payment, every college loan payment, every opportunity to get your kids into a good private school, all counted on nothing ever changing. And now everything's changing, which means A lot of mortgage payments aren't going to be made. A lot of houses are going for sale. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to the actual physical economy in Washington. People have been watching the real estate market to see what happens, and we'll see how it unfolds. But it's fundamentally altering how Washington operates because without the billions and billions of dollars from the federal government, the machine stops. And again, that opens. It doesn't mean everything gets great and rosy and all the problems are solved. It just means that we live in a different world. Things are going to operate differently, and that's why. Look, it's why the Democrats don't know what to do. The Republicans don't know what to do. These guys are poleaxed. I mean, Chuck Schumer, who is a vicious political animal, rolled over and asked Trump to scratch his belly over that continuing resolution. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, he looked defeated. And I mean, that alone, I mean, my whole life, Chuck Schumer has been a pit bull. And to see him like that, it really screamed at me that, man, something wild is going on in Washington right now. These people, it's not that they're terrified. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to respond. They don't know what to say. And that's all good. I mean, we're on the side that says destroy the status quo. So the status quo is being destroyed. Now, what comes after, we'll see. It could be worse, or it could be something we don't like. Who knows? But at least we've moved the ball down the field to this point.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Northern Virginia real estate prices because I have checked, and they are absolutely cratering. I mean, I think that the average home price in 1 week, and I haven't checked since then, had cratered almost $80,000, which is even in an area that's fairly well off, that's apocalyptic. And I just want to say I could not feel less sympathy, right? And I'll be honest, there's a part of this that, look, to me, there's a certain amount of cultural decline that I don't think we're going to be able to cheat our way out of, right? But given the choice between cultural decline with, the eternal HR state and watching these people have to squirm a little bit, I'll certainly take the second option, right? And, as you mentioned, these have been the things that the conservative movement has been trying to get done for years, decades. And the fact that, that so many changes were made so quickly and that, these people are basically in a tailspin, it's heady, right? It's easy to, to get swept away in it because, as you mentioned, these people they conceptualize themselves as a distinct class. They see themselves as better, as above people like you and I. And to realize how unstable that was, right? To realize that, you're effectively one stroke of a pen away from being a normal person. They don't seem to be coping with that well. And, again, I'm just going to repeat myself. I could not feel less sympathy.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie and say I'm not enjoying this. I often think about when I see one of them who are still on Twitter, moaning about how terrible things are, and I think, man, this is great. This is why why the Germans gave us the word Schadenfreude. We don't have a good word in English for it, but I find myself from time to time tempted to lick my computer monitor to taste the sweet, salty tears of these people. But yeah, look, at the end of, I mean, in a lot of ways, what we're going through here is the Cold War is finally ending. All the mechanisms that built up over this time to win the Cold War should have been turned off in 1992 with Bill Clinton. And actually, there was talk about that in 1992. But you know what? There was just too many good jobs at good wages. And instead, they went a different way. And we've reached the end of that road. We're at the end of the unipolar moment, the post-Cold War, the end of history, all that other bullshit. And a lot of this stuff just has to be taken apart. And a lot of it is driven by the fact that our richest people are oligarchs. It was not an accident that all the richest men and most powerful corporate leaders were at Trump's inauguration and made sure they showed up at Mar-a-Lago. They swung behind this guy because I think they realized that a lot of bad things were happening and they needed to head this stuff off. The country was in a lot more trouble, perhaps, than really we realized. And that's what this is all about. I've talked about it as, America Inc. is going through a resizing. The board of trustees, the board of directors, whatever you want to call them, they decided management was screwing up. We had enough. We got to change things. And they're bringing in new management. They're downsizing things, getting rid of certain departments. We're going to outsource certain functions back to the private sector. And some aspects will be sold off. And that's what's happening in foreign policy. Basically, we're going to privatize Europe. We're going to take it. We're going to set it up as its own thing and say you're on your own now. Go figure out how to be a civilization again. And that's a lot what's happening here. And there's longer cycles too. I've written and talked about this. If you go back and look at Nixon, a lot of the bad stuff that we have today that seems to be falling apart started under Nixon. I mean, that's there's no question about it. The Paleos wrote a lot about this. The growth of the managerial state and that. But what we're going through, it's an interesting thing though. In the Cold War bit is important because at the end of the Cold War, Russia was a poor country, but was a lawful country, and then it became a poor country that was unlawful, and it reorganized itself, and now it's becoming it's all back to being a lawful country, and it's slowly its economy. I mean, it's doing pretty well economically. The United States is a rich country that had become lawless. We don't realize just how lawless we were over the last 10 years. I mean, all the stuff they did to Trump, but throwing these J6 people into dungeons. I mean, the abuses of these people's basic civil rights was just monstrous. No one talks about that too much. I mean, fortunately, they've all been pardoned, but all kinds of things. I mean, there's just lots of terrible things that we're becoming lawless. And now I think we're going to go through this really rough period where we're probably going to get a little poorer. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The economy is going to have some difficult moments, but if we can come back to being a lawful society again and having some sanity back to how our country's run, we'll do okay. We'll survive the transition. And that really is what we're experiencing now. We're at the beginning of this great transition out of this past. As I like to say, we're about to join everybody else in the 21st century now. We'll stop talking about 1938, 1968, 1984, all these dates that just keep coming up over and over again. We'll finally be able to shut the door on that stuff. And that means we're also going to have to, we're going to have to develop a new set of values, things that are important to us, new customs and culture. You don't go back and say, oh, well, we're just going to go and adopt these old ways. It doesn't work that way. So it's going to be an interesting time. I say interesting, not necessarily good interesting. There's going to be some bad interesting as well, because a lot of the stuff we take for granted is going to be called into question. I say stuff, our values, our point in our lives as individuals, how we go about things, how we work, how we spend our money. A lot of stuff's going to change, and some people will do better than others.
Yeah, to me, and this might be recency bias, but if you could pin down a moment that it seems as if, the post-war consensus died, right? The so-called rules-based international order was, finally the nail was put into the coffin. It was, Trump and Vance's interaction with Zelensky. Because to me, and I know there was some coverage of this that, said it's all a game, right? It was a deliberate plan to create some kind of media spectacle. I don't believe that, right? To me, that seems as if, Trump and Vance, after a fairly long conversation, got rightfully very annoyed with the rat king of Ukraine. And in the week since, right, the discussion over, what will likely be a peace in Ukraine has basically just been between Donald Trump and the Russian government. Right, there's no even fig leaf anymore that Zelensky has a say in this matter. And look, I know that the Europeans are making noises. We will see what the Europeans end up doing, but I think that that's an interesting move, right? The recognition, which let's be honest, may have always been true, that really what this matters is this kind of conversation between individual leaders of a nation, more so than this system of different UN Security Councils and all that. And I think that to a certain degree, it's a more honest view of it, right? It is how it has always happened, just kind of stripped of a certain level of nicety. And when I look at this, right, the analogy to the late Soviet Union is kind of apt, because that was a an aging system that no one really believed in anymore, but it just had this kind of momentum. And, I think that a certain part of the kind of like U.S. international empire faced the same problem, right? That it was out of date. It was kind of coasting on, the cultural ideas of a previous era, and it was floundering, right? And to me, and I could be wrong, but I think that in 20, 30 years, that will be seen as the kind of like emblematic moment of that shift.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. Recency bias is the right word. Because a couple weeks ago, Paul Ramsey and I did a show on Reagan, and we both were teenagers when Reagan was riding high. And one of the things we talked about is that if you lived in that period, you thought, man, Reagan's he's going to be on Mount Rushmore. He's up there. He's FDR, two great presidents of the 20th century, and then Lincoln, and Jefferson, Well, I don't think about Reagan at all anymore. All these years later, I mean, I lived through it. So I should, getting into my geezerhood, I should be nostalgic for those days. Don't think about it at all. And it's weird how that those things can happen. Stuff that's important in the moment can easily just disappear from the collective consciousness, and things that didn't seem all that important at the time can rise up. I think right now, if I were going to guess at something that was sort of a pivot point, it's going to be the 2020 election. I think a lot of people, not just average Americans, but I think a lot of wealthy people looked at that and said, what the hell is going on here? I mean, everything about that was shocking to a lot of people. Some, it was shocking for different reasons. But I think generally that people looked at that and said, you know what? We've become lawless. We're that's no different than the Senate assassinating Caesar in Rome. I mean, this is the break. And I think in the fullness of time, we'll look back and say that was the moment in which the economic elites, a lot of cultural elites, a lot of people started talking privately that, hey, we've got a big problem here. Something's gone horribly wrong. And so I think that may be it. I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I do think that turned out to be a seminal moment, because it's not just the election itself. I think it was also the treatment of the people, the attitudes. I mean, just the sneering contempt of the average person by Washington. I think that shocked a lot of people. And, it was downhill ever since. I mean, that was really peak bad guys. It was peak, all the bad guys. That was their best time. And if you think about it, every month, every year from that point forward, things got worse and worse for the bad guys. When did Musk buy Twitter? Was it 2023, 2022, something like that's when it started?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. So, that there's another item you could point to and say that was a turning point. Because look, this is basically the richest man in the world saying, I'm going to buy one of the more influential platforms because I disagree with the politics, which happens to be the politics of the people in charge. That had to be a big message. If you're the second richest guy, you took notice. If you're the 20th richest guy, you took notice. So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how people look back on it as how things change. But I do think, and it really brings up, actually, something just popped in my head, as a good example of how you never know. When Trump came down that escalator, how many people thought he would be this world-altering figure? He would be this arguably in the running for one of the most important people in the last 50 years. I don't think anybody. I can't imagine anybody, not even Donald Trump, thought that he was going to be this seminal figure. When you look at the last 10 years, I mean, this man went from being an entertaining television and real estate entrepreneur to being the most consequential man in the lifetime of half the country. I mean, you have to be old like me to think, well, there was more consequential people when I was younger. But I honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if you asked me 5 years from now, I'll say, yeah, Trump was probably the most consequential figure in my lifetime because everything changed during that period. So I don't know. I mean, you can, that pivot point of history, the inflection point. 100 years from now, who knows what it will be? But but certainly right now, I think there's a lot of contenders. The 2020 election, Musk buying Twitter, Trump getting shot. I mean, think about the enormity of that. I mean, there's been a lot of history in the last 10 years.
Well, and look, I've joked a couple times that COVID was Vietnam for Gen Z. and they'll never shut up about it. But I do think there's something to that, right? That was, and it was hard to tell at the time, right? If that was, as we heard from, certain figures at the WF, if that was really the new normal, right? If they had done it, if they had, they had managed to, get the ring and become, kind of like the eternal HR overlords of the world. And, I think the further and further we get away from it, it seems as if, no, that was sort of a last gasp, right? That was a massive miscalculation, basically putting all your chips on the table. And, while it certainly had a short to medium term benefit, right? They were able to do a lot of things they wanted in a short amount of time. It cost them too much, right? They expended too much political capital. And now they're being punished for it. To me, I think that, a neat heuristic, right, when kind of parsing if something is a win or not, is basically, do your enemies get punished? Do your friends get rewarded? Right? It's not particularly sophisticated, but it works. And in this case, our enemies are certainly being punished, right? The unaccountable bureaucracy is being brought to heel. They are losing their jobs. They are, at best, being forced to retire early. At worst, like the Voice of America reporters, they're just, thrown out on their ear. And the other side, right, are our friends being rewarded? I would say yes, right? Like you mentioned the Jan 6 protesters. And what's interesting about that is at first it was, just pardons for the quote unquote nonviolent offenders. But when it actually came time for Trump to sign them, he just signed everyone, right? He let them all go. And look, like I am not the kind of person who would have really in any context been likely to be at an event like, the electoral justice protest. But nonetheless, right, those are our people, right? Those are good, normal Americans. And the fact that, they were freed from jail while all of these people are being fired, that's a strong indication that, this was a good move for us, right?
Yeah, it's again, you can't expect. I some people, and I frankly, I've lost all patience with the black pillars. Yeah, there's times where when you lose or things are going bad, there's some for some reason or other, it feels good to kind of black pill, and I get that. We all do it. You do it in everything. It's not just politics, but yeah, you look at sporting events. People who watch sports, there's a joke. I can't wait for the game, and then 5 minutes later, I want to kill myself. Fire the coach. It's true. It's kind of how we normally react. But right now, in the balance, things are really going our way. I mean, look, there was a time where a lot of people who were online, or I know people who dropped out of politics because they were terrified of the SPLC or any of these lunatics on Twitter getting their information and trying to destroy their lives. They could actually get people fired. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. that is over with. And those people have all been herded into blue sky so they can be weird with each other and ignored by everybody else. It's kind of like it's become a zoo. People go over there, or some of these Reddit subreddits, you go, to just see what the crazies are up to. In China, they actually have tours where you can go right to the North Korean border and look and see the North Koreans. It's kind of like they treat it like a zoo, where you look over the border at the North Korean zoo. We have the same thing now with these crazies who were riding high just 5 or 6 years ago. So, I mean, there's just tons of good stuff happening. But again, it's not, we're not turning 50, 60, 70 years of mistakes over in what's it, Trump been in office, 3 months, 2 months? It's going to take a lot longer. This is a generational project that's starting now. Trump will hopefully hand the baton off to Vance, and Vance will continue this project. And, 2032, people will look back and be shocked that people actually were willing to tolerate things like COVID or, the doxing business or, any of this kind of stuff. The world will be that much different. I mean, that's the hope. I mean, it's my hope anyway.
Well, to me, I actually think one of the most significant stories that has kind of fallen out of the discussion rather quickly is the so-called, quote, big balls situation, right? So for a little bit of background, right? There was this kid. I believe he was working with Doge. I can't remember what. Uh, excuse me. And he had an edgy Twitter account called Big Balls, where he would say things that would be quite familiar to us and ours, right? It was an edgy Twitter alt, and this got revealed. It was brought to the attention of the government, and he was initially fired. Right? That's actually pretty normal, right? That sort of thing has happened a number of times. But what's interesting is that JD Vance comes to this kid's defense. He basically says, we don't do this anymore. We don't, fire people because of, what our enemies think about them. And look, like I've certainly been skeptical of Vance, but that I found that kind of endearing. It's like fair enough, right? And the fact that he is routinely denied the moral authority of his opposition, I think that's a very strong development, especially when you consider, right, that regardless of your opinion on Vance, it's very clear that he is being groomed as the successor. Because in the Big Balls case, right, a reporter asks Trump, well, what do you think of this? And what does Trump do? Well, he looks to Vance and basically says, well, I don't know anything about it, but if Vance says it's a good idea, it has my seal of approval.
Yeah.
And it's done. And that's significant for a number of reasons, right? Because that is a signal from the very top that this kind of like eternal cancellation that has kind of plagued the right for decades, that will not be tolerated anymore. And look, well, obviously, the stated recipient for that was the activist left. I think the other people who were on notice of that was basically the conservative movement, right? You mentioned Francis earlier, and we all know what happened to him, right? He got canceled, not by, the left-wing radicals of his day, but, by Dinesh D'Souza, right? Within the house, so to speak. And so, again, I think that that's a very promising trend if that continues.
Yeah, look, I will. I'll pat myself on the back for being early on Vance. But when he was third place in the polls when he first launched his Senate campaign, I wrote an essay explaining why he was the best choice, and everything I wrote in there turned out to be right. And the reason is that Vance, he's an interesting guy. He's actually a real flesh and blood person. He grew up poor, and he wasn't living under a bridge or anything like that. But he grew up working class, I guess the way to put it. But he wanted to be one of the beautiful people. And he got there and he realized that his only reason that they allowed him in was because he was really nothing more than a lawn jockey. He was this token they could put on their charm bracelets and say, oh, we helped a poor guy. We allowed a poor guy in. And I think it set off a revolution in his mind that said, no, I'm not going to live like this. I'm not going to be this kind of guy. And he's become a different person. And you could see it. I mean, I say this as someone who kind of went through a very similar experience. So, I mean, I guess it's easier for me to recognize. But, he's just a different guy than he was, before he really kind of down this road. And he denies the other side's moral claims. He does, he is not, he's kind of like a guy who is outside of their religion and doesn't really care to know about their religion. And he has no interest in following the edicts of their religion. So he just, shrugs his shoulders when they say these things. And that's a great thing. That is a huge development. And I think in a lot of ways that Trump sensed this about Vance. He wasn't going to pick Vance until he got shot. And then he clearly changed his mind and decided to go with Vance for this reason. I think the best thing that ever happened is that happened to us probably is that they took a shot at Trump and missed. But I think, Vance in a lot of ways, what he stepped in and saved Big Balls, it was the end. It killed the whole doxing world. All these efforts. I mean, it was on thin ice right away. But when the second most important guy in the world says, "I don't care if you want me to fire this guy, we're not going to do it. Go screw." That's it. They lost all of their authority. They have nothing left at that point. And again, it's another good thing. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can go out in public and start using racial epithets without without consequence. We still have generally agreed upon behavior that you're not supposed to say certain things and do certain things in public and all that. I mean, and I don't think anybody should complain about that. But if you use some locker room humor in a private chat, or you get a little carried away on Twitter or something, well, the mature adult response now is reel it back in a little bit. Don't be so careless and move on. It's not this, oh my God, we've got to banish this person and destroy his life. Because I mean, think about how weird this is, that people were having their lives destroyed because of something they tweeted. I mean, think about just how insane that is. It's the kind of thing that you would expect in a grammar school, where all of a sudden you did something wrong on the schoolyard, and so you have this mark on your permanent record, and you're going to carry this with you into the next grade. You have this reputation forever. It's just childish and silly. So I think Vance has done us all a great service by what he did there, but I also think he's done a lot of other stuff like this too. I mean, he's what he's become is kind of like Peskov is or Medvedev rather. Probably like Medvedev for Putin. Putin is he kind of is the good cop, and he tries to keep things light, and Medvedev comes out and just shreds people. And you see that happening. Trump's like the nice guy. And Vance is, he's the animal. He comes out and he breaks legs. So it's fun to watch. It's another part of all this that I'm enjoying a great deal.
Yeah, I think that one of the other things that's been kind of interesting is to watch the clash of Trump, right, who seems to be committed to being this Article 2 executive, and the judicial branch. Most recently, I believe, I can't remember what his first name was. It was a Judge Boasberg, who I believe is Italian. I'm not entirely sure about that. Had basically issued this order saying, President of the United States is not allowed to deport Venezuelans to Venezuela, right? That is simply not allowed. And the reaction was quite interesting, because Trump basically told him, to quote, to kind of paraphrase Andrew Jackson, you in what army, right? Which I think is another interesting thing, because if we compare and contrast to Trump round one, right, the 2016 presidency, there were a lot of really positive things said that just kind of sunk into the mud, right? They never went anywhere. They got endlessly wrapped up in court. And so I'm curious to see, similar to what we saw with the unaccountable bureaucracy, if there will be, some sort of, I guess, kind of settlement reached with the judicial branch, because at least up until recently, that was the kind of seat of final power in the U.S.
Yeah, I think as we're recording this, I'm just looking on Twitter, and some lunatic judge has ordered Trump to said that all the end of USAID and all the firings and all that are unconstitutional, and everyone has to be hired back, given all their email back and everything else. Well, that's not going to happen. I mean, the buildings are closed, the computers are already headed for the dumpster. I mean, this is just silly. And that's the problem here, is that all these inferior court judges, these are public acts of piety. They're just making asses out of themselves and out of the system. And I think at some point this is going to head to a showdown. It has to happen to a showdown, because look, we don't have a fourth branch of government called independent agency. That doesn't exist. Either these agencies report to and are in control of the executive, or they're in the under the control of Congress. That's it. I mean, there's only two choices. And of course, Congress set them up and put them in the executive. So it's dried. So it's headed to a showdown, I think, and a long overdue showdown. The courts need to have their sails trimmed, sure. And what's his name? Roberts kind of signaled this. People read this the wrong way. He came out and he chastised Trump for saying that some Boasberger should be impeached. And frankly, I would have no problem with them putting the FBI on this guy. He was up to his eyeballs in the Russian collusion hoax. He colluded with the FBI to get phony baloney FISA warrants. I mean, this guy is crooked. He should be on the list regardless of this stuff. And but that may be what has to happen. You rough up a judge this way, with have the FBI carting out all of his electronics and everything else, that do the same stuff to him that he did to all the J6 people, to send a message to the rest of these judges. But I think it's going to end up in appeals, and I think at some point the court is going to clarify this stuff. And Roberts seemed to be signaling that, saying, look, instead of going to war with these inferior court judges, bring it to the appeal, and you'll get remedy. And I think that's what he was signaling to the White House. And for the order of the country, it would be good if it happened. But if Plan B is rounding up some judges and sending them out to work camp somewhere in Louisiana, either way is fine by me. I don't care. I've lost all patience with the court system with these. Some of these judges are just lunatics. They have no business being in the bar, much less as a federal judge. So, if Caesarism is the only answer, then that's what we'll have to do.
Well, Z-Man, I have no idea how you could call into question the legitimacy of a system where Judge Keontae Jackson is sitting on the Supreme Court.
She probably has an IQ under 100. If I actually went and looked at some of the things this woman's a moron. How in the hell she actually got it through law school? There's a thing that happens in the law. Someone told me this, said that everyone suspects that there's certain people who somehow or other pass the bar, despite the fact that they probably couldn't ever score a competent enough score to pass the bar. They just get passed through. And Crockett, that crazy woman who does the Ghetto Girl Act, the congressman from Houston, was it Jasmine Crockett?
Yes, I believe that's her name.
Yeah, she went to like Fred's Law School. It was legitimately like Fred's Law School. It's like a law school run out of an old grocery store. And somehow or other she passed the bar in Texas. But Jumanji Jackson. This is embarrassing. That's like putting a horse on the Supreme Court, or a block of wood or something. Come on.
Look, if we're really speed running, the sort of end of empire. I feel like getting a horse as president would be kind of our just desserts, right? I certainly couldn't be worse than the. Sorry, someone's driving a clapped out Honda outside my window here. But you couldn't, right? When you compare that, right? Having a horse as emperor to having a previous president who turns out signed all of his executive orders via robot, right? He couldn't even hold a pen. There's a question to be asked of what would be the difference, really.
Yeah, I think we were talking earlier about these kind of inflection points, these things. There was a guy, Mark Andreessen, the guy who invented Netscape, really one of the first browsers, and way back. And he's a big mover and shaker now. I think it's Andreessen Horowitz is his investment firm, and he talked about how back in like 2022, he had a meeting with the Biden administration about technology, particularly AI. And he came away, said, we have to stop these people. They're insane. And, he looked around and said, well, okay, Donald Trump is the only option here to try and put an end to this madness. You think about how terrible that meeting must have went if you went in as a guy who was generally in favor of the Democrats and came out and said, I'm now a revolutionary. I want to overthrow the government. That must have been one hell of a meeting. But a lot of this has, really due to the fact of putting a vegetable. You're a young guy, you don't remember this, but Joe Biden has been around so long that he was an old guy in Washington when I was a young guy. When I was a teenager, Joe Biden was in Washington.
I even remember. I'm the ancient history that is the Obama administration, and even back then. The running joke was he's kind of stupid, right? Yes. I think it was Barack Obama himself who said, I wouldn't trust him to make me a cup of coffee, right? He's not exactly a savvy political actor.
Yeah, back in he ran in '88, and it was terrible. But back in the '80s, I was a teenager. I worked for a congressman, and so I was just running errands, stuff like that. And I remember Joe Biden jokes. They used to talk about, it was a running joke that he was so stupid, and he would tell these outlandish whoppers, these stories about, his heroism and all this stuff. If he went on some congressional junket or something, he'd come back and, he would talk about it, like he was on some James Bond adventure. he was just a complete ridiculous person. But the thing about it is that he was reliable to represent the credit card companies in Delaware, and they didn't care. Him being stupid was actually an asset. But so the idea of this moron, I mean, look, it didn't get any better. I mean, they actually cracked open his skull, I think, in the 90s and carved some stuff out that was growing in there. And then, he gets dementia and we make him president. I mean, a horse would have been a better choice because at least it would have been honest. And the horse, horses are noble animals. Biden is not.
I think one of the other interesting things to me, you mentioned Andreessen, who, let's put it this way, Andreessen is perhaps more involved in our circles than one would think. And, you have this kind of new cabal of, tech CEOs and entrepreneurs who have, kind of explicitly made their foray into politics, right? You have Elon Musk, who is, it's kind of a bizarre position, right? You have this sort of, he's technically the head of a government agency, right? But he pretty much seems to do whatever he wants. And look, like, I support what he's doing, I more power to him. But it is this kind of odd new development because, and maybe you can speak to this, but the interest groups in the Republican Party have remained remarkably stable, right? You have, a certain Mediterranean democracy. You have, MIC interests, which, let's be honest, aren't that separate. But now you have this kind of third group. And I would almost argue that there seems to be, whether you want to call it like the remnants of the deep state, the old WASP elite, which you can see in, for instance, someone like Tucker, right? And it seems as if, this new political coalition hasn't quite settled yet because, Musk gets to do almost everything he wants, right? He gets to fire whoever he wants. He gets to, gut whatever agency they point him at. But also, right, he got told no on H-1Bs. And so to me, I'm kind of curious to see what the final deal is and where those various interest groups kind of lie in the hierarchy.
Yeah, I tell you, in history, it's always been, with the first forming of any sort of property middle class, that owns stuff, they've always tended to be extremely conservative, as it goes back to the Middle Ages, and in support of the elites, because they look and say, hey, we own a little property, and they own a lot of property, but it doesn't matter. They're going to defend my right to own my little bit of property, and I don't want my little bit of property subjected to the mob. So it was always, historically, the middle and the elite banding together to keep the lower classes under control. Then a weird thing happened in America in the 20th century where you get, the political class in Washington bound the poor and the rich together, in war against the middle class. It was always the upper class and the lower classes against the middle class. And I think that's finally breaking down where, I'm perfectly fine with the rich guys doing whatever the hell they need to do, because at least I know who's accountable. This, for most of my life, I've never known who do you blame for this. Everything just gets worse, and both parties say, "Don't blame us. You voted for the other guy." It's this ridiculous game that they play. And so having a guy like Musk or Zuckerberg or what's his name? What's the guy from Amazon? Bezos.
Bezos.
Yeah, him stepping on the people at the Washington Post and kicking them around. Good. I'm fine with it. Because look, if the rich guys take control of the government and they're going to run things, and if things don't go well, we know where to go. We know where they are. It's not going to be a problem. But when it's this collection of people, they're just these faceless people in charge of committees and stuff. No one's ever accountable for anything. So I'm very much in favor of seeing these rich guys start to be more assertive. But it's interesting, though, with the tech rich guys, is that so many of them had this libertarianish outlook. They adopted libertarianism in order to avoid the cultural stuff. But what they found through libertarianism is the door to our side. That, it's a weird thing. I've had a lot of former libertarians in my life who have come over the great divide to my kind of politics. And, it's not just the economic issues, it's the human capital issues, the hierarchical issues, they come to find out that, hey, wait a second, libertarianism explained to me that no, people are not all the same, and no, people can't be yeoman farmers and independent and all this stuff. You do need to control the masses. You need to have structures in place to do that, and so forth. And it's through the bad results of libertarianism that they discover things like hierarchy and the realities of human capital and end up on this side. And I think the same process has happened to these tech guys. I think they kind of went through the same door. And even though, they're not, they're not going to be showing up at the castle in Berkeley Springs for an event, they're not going to be upset that those events happen. They're going to be aware. They're going to know people who go to those events, and maybe they have their own soirees and wherever these guys meet. But it seems like the same process. I mean, I remember the first time I ever went to an event. I probably can't say the name of it. This is on YouTube, right? So, there were so many people who used to be libertarians, and they were red pilled by Ron Paul, of all things. And I think the same thing's kind of happened with the tech guys. But again, I'm fine. I'm okay with rule by billionaires. I mean, somebody's got to be in charge, and I would rather be a guy who can send a spaceship up to the space station and rescue people than some guy with a PhD in gender studies.
Well, and that's something that, I've sort of made peace with, right? That, simply due to the way humans are, there will always be an oligarchy, right? That's simply how humans organize themselves. But, you can make a quality judgment between those two. There are some elites I'd rather have in charge rather than others. And, to me, right, and I could be wrong, but I see this swap, if it can stick, as being beneficial. And it's not exactly a huge hurdle to clear, but the very fact that these people don't seem to hate me, to want me dead, and people like me to stop existing, that's a win, right? It's certainly better than the alternative. And that doesn't mean that this is like, the kind of like ideal philosopher king, right? Come down to lead us to heaven on earth. But one of the things I think about, and this is an interesting issue, is, the fact that the Trump administration and Musk have been making noises about South Africa. Look, I have, a lot of friends in South Africa. I've met with Ernst, who's recently on Tucker, Conscious Caracal, and I really like those guys. I have a certain affinity for them. The Dutch Calvinists are quite similar, to my people, how they view the world. So there's some kind of affinity there. But realistically, right, what has South Africa existed as in our consciousness, right? It's, it is the Rainbow Nation, right? We did it. We defeated racism. And the fact that you have, Marco Rubio basically kicking out the South African diplomat, basically offering, hey, South Africans are, experiencing ethnic cleansing. If they want to move to America, they can. That's a strong indication that, there's at least a desire to appear as if, the Trump administration doesn't hate white people, which, again, like I've said, is not the biggest hurdle to clear. But, compare that to our previous demented executive. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, look, Vance brought up the whole two-tier Keir Starmer, the two-tier system, and I mean, there's stuff coming out of this administration you never thought you would hear. It's the kind of stuff that got you fired from Twitter, or got you thrown off of Twitter, rather. So, it's a positive thing. I think it was Charles Murray who said, this a long time ago, before he got all squishy. He said, inevitably, what's going to happen is that the elites are probably going to become more racially aware than any group in the country, because for them, it's the only way in which they can remain elites. It's a necessary reality they have to embrace. And I suspect that's really what we're seeing, is that, I've called it civilizationalism. We're not going to, I mean, these guys running around saying, oh, we want to have an ethno state or something like that. I just shake my head at it, because that's not who we're going to be in North America. What we're going to have is a civilization, and there'll be a hierarchy to that civilization, and we'll just accept it. And that comes with some duties. The people at the lower down they are those are people who have to be looked after. You have to make sure their neighborhoods are as safe as you can make them, that they have food and the basics and so forth, and they have order imposed upon them. There are certain parts of this country will just have to have a Hobbesian existence where order will have to be imposed. I used to live in one of them. I lived in Baltimore for a long time. You could make Baltimore better, but it means abandoning all these ridiculous abstract ideas about equality and openness and all, democracy and all the other junk. No, there should be a dictator who's in charge and runs things with an iron fist. Everyone will be happier as a result of it. But you don't have to do that in Salt Lake City, Utah. You can have whatever kind of government you want there because the human capital is better. This is just a practical reality. And I think, it kind of gets to one of my other themes, and that is we're experiencing the end of ideology. The last ideology is dying out, American progressivism. So that means all these goofy ideas about democracy and openness and fairness and all this. Now, what's going to matter in the future is practical results. Do we have cheaper food and cheaper energy and safer neighborhoods? Those are things that matter. How we accomplish them, we're not going to get hung up on. And that's a good thing. You see, because other parts of the world are headed down this way. The Chinese, for goodness sakes, have abandoned communism. The Russians abandoned communism. So we have to kind of join the other great powers in being practical and pragmatic. And I think it's possible. I think that may be what we're experiencing now.
So we are fast coming up on time, Z-Man. I really enjoyed this conversation, despite my health issues. Hopefully I wasn't a complete dribbling moron. But if people want to find more of you and your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
The easiest way is to go to thezman.com, or you can go to thedissidentwrite.com or thedissidentwriter.com. I got a bunch of different domains, but thezman.com is the easiest one. It has all my stuff there. I post something every day. I have a podcast every Friday. It has links to my pay-per-view site, so you can get additional content, Twitter, Gab accounts, all that junk.
Well, I highly recommend your show. It's one of the few, actually, that I listen to as a matter of course. There are a lot of people who produce content. I do realize the irony in saying that, but very few that I consider worthwhile enough that I listen to whatever you put out. So I highly recommend that. As far as my stuff, right, the Jay Burden Show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can do so with the links down in the description, or you can check out our sponsors, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching, and then North Appalachian Supply, if you've got any gear needs. Again, Z-Man, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.